welcome back to American DA Live. On today's show, host Jack Patty, Ray the DA, and Michigan's prosecuting attorney Crystal Roche will discuss the Paul Afton case. Paul was beaten and shot to death back in March 2000, and 6 months after his shooting, Michigan State Police assembled their first cold case team in the history of the 6th District in Michigan. In late 2000, Wheatley, Hobbs, and Jones were stopped by police, and after matching the tire tracks on their car and fingerprints, all three were charged with murder in February 2001. Stay tuned for more details on this case.
Be with us in the studio, and it's exactly what she's done. Tell us about our guest this morning.
Emma Wilson is is an intern with our office. She's going to graduate from the University of Kentucky, and her mom, she told me some time ago, was a prosecutor in Michigan, and so I said, well, have her tell us about some interesting cases, and we did talk about one already, and as you said, Crystal Roche was invited. You invited her to come see us, and here she is.
Glad that you're in town. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome.
Introduce yourself a little bit to us, Crystal, and you're going to have to really speak up next to that microphone.
I have practiced law for 30 years, and a little beyond that. I spent more than half that time as the elected prosecuting official of my jurisdiction, 2/3 of the time in the prosecution of criminal acts itself.
Tell me about your jurisdiction. When you ask somebody from Michigan, where are you from in Michigan, they immediately hold their hand up, because your hand, if you keep your thumb next to the rest of your hand, is shaped like Michigan.
It's the mitt, yes.
Yeah, so tell us where you're from and a little bit about the jurisdiction.
I'm actually from the Lakeshore area, and the jurisdiction I have been assisting in the governing lies about 30 miles inland from the west coast of Michigan. It is a physically large county, mostly rural, north of Grand Rapids, which is a population center, and so we have a lot of residents who work in Grand Rapids, and then we have crime spillover from adjoining counties.
You had, in 15 years you prosecuted, is that what you said?
Yes, a little over.
You've had some interesting cases, and the one we want to talk about today brings together a number of issues. First of all, it's a cold case. You had significant difficulty getting the case, keeping it in court. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the facts of this case that we're talking about today?
A man by the name of Paul Afton was at a very large gathering at a tavern in the northern part of my county. He disappeared, and no one knew what happened to him. Ironically, approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, and the bars close in Michigan at 2:30, approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, a man by the name of Trowbridge was walking home through this rural area and heard shots fired. When he called out, shots were then fired at him. He saw taillights of a vehicle, a dome light come on, vehicle drove away. Trowbridge obviously was very upset, continued on his way home, and stumbled across the body of Paul Afton. Trowbridge then called the police, and the investigation began.
Well, so as the prosecutor, when are you notified about these things?
Within moments of the police being called to a homicide.
All right. So tell us about the investigation of this case.
The police, primarily the state police, because this, again, was not in a municipal area, so the Michigan State Police, assisted by the Sheriff's Department, began the investigation, involving a grid search of quite a large area, approximately a mile.
Now, what is a grid search?
A grid search is performed by officers squaring off an area, measuring it off, and very carefully at several foot intervals, going back and forth across to determine whether there's any physical evidence available. Footprints.
What was the terrain like? Was it just Densely wooded, yeah.
wooded and sort of a bit rolling hills, not steep, maybe 20, 30-foot hills.
Why was Trowbridge walking through there at 3 o'clock in the morning?
We wondered that as well. He had been at a friend's house, supposedly watching TV, drinking beer, doing assorted other substances, of which we were unclear.
Okay.
There you go.
Not a great witness, maybe? Because,
Terrible
yeah,
witness.
yeah. And I'm sure it was dark, too.
It was pitch black.
Well, this grid search is interesting, and the process, because, for example, if we had a case in which a person was shot in a field, and they got a number of the police out, and they stretched their arms out and touched one another's fingers, and then they just form a line and they just walk back and forth looking for anything. In the case that I'm talking about, they found shell casings, and that's what the whole concept of this grid search is all about. So what did they find, and just take us through this investigation?
The body of Paul Afton was determined to have been beaten very severely prior to death. Also, he had suffered at least 5 gunshot wounds, although they were through and back and forth, indicating that he had turned, twisted, cowered, attempted to get away. We, through the investigation and the grid search, discovered no shell casings at the site of Paul Afton's body. There were, however, cigarette butts, the contents of his wallet, no cash in the wallet, but his ID strewn about. In the area where Trowbridge had been walking, there were in fact 22 caliber shell casings, and there were slugs in the trees over Trowbridge's head, or where he would have been standing when the shots were fired. Additionally, they found tire prints from the vehicle, so those were measured, casted, photographed, etc.
Casted. Tell us what that means.
Plaster cat. After there is a measurement and photography of a tire print, the evidence technologists will go ahead, or technicians will go ahead and pour plaster or some hardening substance into the tire print so that a permanent impression is retained.
You mentioned something just a second ago, Crystal, about the through and through, back and forward, which indicated that the victim in this case had been twisting and turning. This brings in the medical examiner evidence, Jack. So the medical examiner told you what?
Medical examiner Stephen Cole is a board-certified forensic pathologist based in Grand Rapids. He has written textbooks on the subject. He's brilliant. He's an excellent witness. He showed clearly the most likely behavior that Paul Afton went through prior to his death. There was a shot through and through the right upper arm into the chest wall. Slug remained. There were through and through in the calves. There were through and through in the torso. I believe ultimately there were 2 slugs removed from the body of Paul Afton, and Dr. Cole said these were consistent with a .38 caliber revolver.
Not the 22.
Not the 22.
Yeah. You know, Jack, when Ray Rector was here and he was witness, he watched the Carlos Ordway trial. This path of bullets basically told the jury how this murder in that instance occurred. So this is significant stuff in a trial, I think. Okay, so tell us what happens with the investigation.
We had bits of physical evidence. The most telling were the cigarette butts. There were a number of cigarette butts around the body, or in the area adjacent to the location of Paul Afton's body. Most of those cigarette butts were tested, and the DNA showed unknown donors. There was one cigarette butt showing the DNA of Paul Afton, our victim, and an unknown donor. Those were all retained at the lab.
What year did this happen?
2000.
Now, if this had happened in 1983,
we would not approve in this case. Hobbs was driving a vehicle down in another state that was the correct color tone, as well as had the tail lights similar to the pattern that Trowbridge had seen. Additionally, granted it was 2 years later, the vehicle tire prints were consistent with the tire prints at the scene of the homicide. At that point, I authorized search warrants, obtained DNA from Wheatley, Jones, and Hobbs. Wheatley's DNA was on the cigarette butt that also contained Paul Afton's. And then I began a process called the prosecutor's investigative subpoena, which in Michigan is similar to a grand jury, although there's no judge sitting there. And one of the things Wheatley did was deny ever sharing a cigarette with Paul Afton. And that was the best evidence I had.
Well, so Mike's question was about Trowbridge, and he was a little bit ahead of our description here, because the evidence that Trowbridge gave to you all was the type of tail lights and apparently the color of the vehicle.
Correct.
And so that was valuable in at least getting to these guys. So what, based on all of that, did you end up charging these people?
I charged all three of them with conspiracy to commit robbery armed, felony murder by robbery armed, and then felony firearm, which is an enhancement. Because Jones was only 16 at the time of charging, I had to file an automatic waiver to try him as an adult. Went to preliminary examination, probable cause hearing. They were all bound over to stand trial at that point in circuit.
Let me understand, you only had evidence for one of the three of them, right?
I had evidence that they were all three together. I had evidence from the beating, according to Dr. Cole, that there were at least 2 people involved, if not 3.
To hear the whole program, click below or tune in every Friday morning at 9 a.m. on WVLK News Talk 590.